Okay, so today we will continue with Yirmiyahu, and there was a request to do something about Pesach and the Haggadah, which is next week. We don't meet next Wednesday, obviously. Wednesday night is Pesach, so I will speak a lot about the Haggadah and Pesach, but I did want to start with Yirmiyahu, where we're up to, hi Zella, and where we're up to last week, and actually it's relevant to Pesach, and that is that after the assassination of Gedaliah, which is found in chapter 41, after the assassination, we are told, and this is chapter 41, in the, beginning with the 16th verse, with Tet Zion, it says that in verse number 16, chapter 41, Vayikach Yochanan ben Kareach v'chol sarei hachayolim asher ito ekol sharita am asher heshiv be'et Yishmael ben Netanya ben HaMitzpah acharikot Gedaliah ben Achikam Givarim Anshe HaMilchama ben Achikam v'nashlim v'tav Sarisim asher heshiv ben Givon Vayelchu vayeshvu begeirut kimham asher etzel beit lechem v'lechet lavo mitzrayim. So what we're told over here in these verses is that the assassination of Gedaliah is found in chapter 41. We'll get back to that in a minute. And then after Gedaliah is assassinated by Yochanan, not by Yochanan, Yochanan actually is on the other side. Ishmael ben Netanya ben Elishama. So the one who assassinates Gedaliah is named Ishmael, interesting name, Ishmael, and he has a group. He has his 10 men with him, and he assassinates Gedaliah. Gedaliah was warned beforehand. At the end of chapter 40, he was warned by Yochanan that Gedaliah is out, that you're in danger, because the king of Ammon has conspired against you, and that Ishmael plans to kill you. And he says to Gedaliah, and if you want, I'll get rid of, I'll kill Ishmael, and why should he just destroy you? And the remnant that's left will be dispersed. And Gedaliah doesn't believe him. Gedaliah says, it's not so. Sheker atah dover Yishmael, the last words of chapter 40, you speak falsely about Yishmael. He trusts Yishmael. He's a bit naive over here, and he trusts Yishmael. And in fact, he's assassinated by Yishmael and his group in chapter 41. Afterwards, there's a battle between Yochanan's people and Yishmael's people, and Yochanan is able to retrieve some of the captives that were taken by Yishmael. And now we're told, beginning in verse number 16, that after he had retrieved these people from Yishmael, he went to a place called Gerut Kimham, next to Bethlehem, next to Beit Lechem, with the intention of going to Egypt. And that's very important. So the intention of Yochanan, who's the leader at this point, is that the remnant that's left after the initial exile to Babel, then the destruction of the temple, there was still a remnant left, and we saw last week that this remnant, under the leadership of Gedaliah, began to attract Jews from all the other lands. And they were coming to join with their brethren in the land of Israel. So there was some hope for a rebuilding, and Gedaliah assured everybody that the Babylonians were okay with all this. They had no problem. But Ishmael, and we'll get to the story, Ishmael kills Gedaliah. And then we're told that the intention of Yochanan, who's fearful of the Babylonians, because since the Jews killed Gedaliah, he's afraid the Babylonians will once again attack Israel and destroy the remnant. And so he takes the people with the intention of going to Egypt. That's stated explicitly in verse number 40, in verse number 17, Lolechet Lavo Mitzrayim. So they're going to go back to Egypt, unbelievably, back to Mitzrayim. But in chapter 42, it says that these soldiers, Yochanan being in charge, and it mentions others as well, Vayomru el Yirmiyahu. So they speak to Yirmiyahu in chapter 42, verse number 2. Yirmiyahu Hanavi speaks to the prophet Yirmiyahu. Tipolna tchinatenu lifanecha v'tpalel ba'adenu el Hashem Elokecha bi'ad kol hasherit hazot ki nish'arnu mi'at meharbe kasher inecha ra'ot otanu. So they asked Yirmiyahu to pray for them. We are the remnant, with a few that remain. V'yagedu lanu Hashem Elokecha et haderech asher nelech ba v'et hadavar asher na'aseh. And they want Yirmiyahu to pray to God to get instruction about what we should do and the path we should take. So they're asking a question. They're saying, listen, you tell us what to do from God, and we will follow that instruction. We want to do what God wants us to do. But Yirmiyahu, in verse number 4, is skeptical. Yirmiyahu says to them, I'm happy to pray for you. I'm going to tell you everything that God says to me. U'emna mikem davar. I'll tell you, I'll do it. I agree to pray and to get divine guidance. That's not a problem. And then they respond to him in verse number 5 of chapter 42. Hema amru Yirmiyahu, Yehi Hashem banu le'ed emet v'neman. Imlo kechol hadavar asher yishlachecha Hashem Elohecha eleinu kein naseh. Im tovim ra. B'kol Hashem Elokeinu asher anachnu shochim otcha elav nishma. V'man asher yetiv lanu ki nishma b'kol Hashem Elokeinu. So they assure him, and whatever message you get from God, whether we think it's good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant, tov or ra, we promise to follow that, to follow God's command. We'll do whatever you tell us to do. Now we have to remember here that, and this is important, that in the previous chapter that we saw earlier, verse number 17, they have encamped near Bethlehem with the intention of going to Mitzrayim. So their intention is already clear. We, the reader, know what they're intending to do, to go to Egypt. They promise that if they're going to obey what God tells them to do, but we have to wonder about that because they're already intending to go to Mitzrayim. They didn't ask first before they make a move towards Egypt. They first make the move towards Mitzrayim, and only afterwards do they ask the question. It reminds me of the end of the book of Shoftim, book of Judges, the story of Pilegesh Bagiva, where the people are shocked by the incident of the Pilegesh Bagiva. That's the man whose wife was murdered, and he chops her body up into 12 pieces. He sends the body around all of Israel, terrible thing. And how could the tribe of Benjamin do this? And the rest of Israel was very shocked by all this, and they mobilized the army. And then they asked the question, should we fight? But the point is, they've already mobilized the army. They've already made all the preparations for war. Then they say, should we go to war or not? So one has to question whether their question is genuine. And the same thing over here. Before we get to the actual story, we take note of the fact they're already headed to Mitzrayim. So the question, should we go to Mitzrayim, is it's a question whether they actually are really asking the question. They say to Yirmiyahu, you tell us what to do. Of course, Yirmiyahu does what they request. And the word of God comes to Yirmiyahu, and this begins in verse number 7 of chapter 42. Vahi miketz aseret yamim, vayidvar Hashem Yirmiyahu, vayikro Yochanan ben Kareach, v'yokol sarei chayalim asher ito l'chol ha'am, u'mikaton v'yad gadol. So he contacts Yochanan and he contacts everybody else, all the people. Ko amar Hashem, he says, this is the message. You sent me, says Yirmiyahu, to inquire, to pray. And the response is, Im shov im shov teshvu ba'aretz hazot, ubaniti etchem v'lo eros, v'natati etchem v'lo etosh. If you stay in the land, this is the message. And the two verbs that are here in verse number 10, I will build and I will plant. Now we recall that building and planting, those were two of the 6 words that were found in the beginning of the book. Yirmiyahu's mission is 4 of them are tearing down and destroying, but 2 of them are building. And the 2 that are building are livnotvil and toa, to build and plant. If you stay in the land, I will build and I will plant. I will not forsake you. I've decided not, says God. I changed my mind. I'm not going to continue to do evil. Asher asiti lachem. I'm going to go a different path. It's safe to stay, and I advise you to stay. And the next verse is, of course, the problem. Al tiru b'pnei melech Bavel. Asher atem yireim mipanav. Al tiru mimenu num Hashem. Ki itchem ani loshia etchem ulatzil etchem biyado. V'yatem lochem rachamim v'richam etchem v'yeshiv etchem ladmatchem. So the response is clear. Don't leave. Don't go back to Mitzrayim. I'm going to build you. I'm going to plant and build, those positive verbs. And concerning the problem, which is the fear of Bavel. 3 times we have the expression in verse number 11, Al Tiru. Al Tiru, the one Asher Yireim, Al Tiru. Al Tiru, Yireim, Al Tiru. Do not be afraid, says God, I will protect you and I will have mercy upon you. That's the message that Yirmiyahu receives in return from God after being requested to pray and being told that whatever God says we're going to do. Now we know they've already headed towards Mitzrayim. And now the continuation of it is what happens if you don't listen. If you go to Egypt, you refuse to obey God's command to stay, then you're going to go to the land of Mitzrayim, and the description of Mitzrayim is found beginning in verse number 16. If you go to Egypt, V'ayta acherev asher atem yireim mimena sham tasig etchem b'eretz Mitzrayim. V'hara'av asher atem doagim mimenu sham yidbak acherechem Mitzrayim v'sham tamutu. So the converse, of course, is if you go to Egypt, which you shouldn't do, everything you're afraid will happen to you if you stay in the land will in fact take place in the land of Mitzrayim. So don't go there for 2 reasons. First of all, you shouldn't go there because you should stay here and build up the land, and I will help you. But secondly, if you go to Mitzrayim, then of course the message is there it will be bad. And in verse 17, V'yiyu kol anoshim asher samu et pneihem lavo Mitzrayim lo gusham yamutu b'cherev bara'av u'vadeber v'lo yeh lahem saridu palit b'mei hara'ah asher ani mevi alehem. And not only that, but the leaders who go to Mitzrayim, they will in fact be punished. They'll suffer the punishment of Dever, Cherev, and Ra'av, those 3 that are a common triad in the book of Yirmiyahu. In short, going to Mitzrayim would be a mistake from every standpoint. Having said all that, Yirmiyahu's speech, I'm not going to go through all this speech now, but it continues all the way through chapter 42. And then in chapter 43, Vahi kichalot Yirmiyahu l'daber el kol ha'am et kol divrei Hashem Elohihem asher shlocho Hashem Elohihem Elohihem et kol ha'dvarim ha'eleh Vayomer Azariah ben Oshiyahu v'Yochanan ben Kareach v'chol ha'anashim ha'zedim omrim el Yirmiyahu sheker ata medaber lo shlochacha Hashem Elokeinu le'mor lo tovo Mitzrayim lo gusham ki baruch ben Neriah mesit otcha banu l'manteto tanu b'yada kastim l'amito tanu u'lagloto tanu Bavel. So they say to Yirmiyahu, it's a lie. God never spoke to you. The whole thing is one big lie. And in fact, the reason that you're doing this, it's interesting, is because Baruch ben Neriah is inciting you against us. Baruch ben Neriah, of course, is Yirmiyahu's faithful scribe, or might say his pupil, his protege, and his scribe. But here we hear that the accusation is that Baruch, in fact, incites you against us. Baruch is the one who is telling you to do this because Baruch is in cahoots with the Babylonians. Interesting accusation of which there is no evidence on any level. Baruch is in cahoots with the Babylonians. He wants us to stay so that the Babylonians will in fact kill us. Sounds like a very far-fetched argument. Maybe Baruch ben Neriah is another way of saying you. They don't want to say you to Yirmiyahu, perhaps. So they say Baruch ben Neriah. In any event, they had made a promise to listen to what God says, and now what they're saying is God never said it. It's not true. God never spoke to you. It's all made up. And we're going to do what we intended to do in the first place, to go back to Mitzrayim. Now, the idea of going back to Mitzrayim, it's a week before Pesach, where we celebrate Yetziat Mitzrayim. The idea of going back to Mitzrayim is a shocker. And for many reasons. One is that the punishment in the Chumash, in the book of Devarim, we have seen throughout these sessions that the book of Yirmiyahu and the book of Devarim have a very close relationship. A lot of the language of Yirmiyahu is drawn from Sefer Devarim, parallel to Sefer Devarim. In the book of Devarim, which speaks of the blessing and the curse in chapter 28, and the last verse of the curse, the admonition, the Tochacha in chapter 28 of Devarim, is Ve'ashivcha Hashem Mitzrayim Baniyot. I will bring you back to Egypt. God will bring you back to Egypt in boats, on the path you thought you would never see again. And you will sell yourselves there as male and female slaves, the Ein Koneh, and none will buy you, or perhaps none will redeem you. So the great punishment in the book of Devarim is to go back to Mitzrayim. And not only is the punishment to go back to Mitzrayim, but when the Chumash speaks about a Jewish autonomy, the possession of the land, creating a state, a place which is the Jewish state, Jewish land, and the book of Devarim speaks about the different institutions that are connected to being an autonomous nation, and one of which is the kingship, the political leadership. And the Torah warns about the king. The Torah is concerned that you choose the wrong kind of king. You want a king that God is okays, that God sanctions, and a king who understands that the responsibility of the king is to the people. So the Torah says about a king, it doesn't tell you what the king does, but it says what a king should not do. He shouldn't have excess. No, not too many wives, too much money, too many horses. And he shouldn't have too many horses with the intention of bringing the people to Mitzrayim. He shouldn't bring the people back to Mitzrayim. So the idea of going back to Mitzrayim, which is the ultimate punishment in the book of Devarim, and it's the ultimate punishment because it's a complete reversal of the entire story of the Torah. Story of the Torah of the Jewish people begins with the Yetziat Mitzrayim. It begins with the Exodus, because in Mitzrayim we're not really a people because we have no freedom. We can't make our own choices. So the leaving of Mitzrayim is the beginning of Jewish peoplehood. And the story of the Torah is moving from a place where we can't make choices to a place where we have autonomy, as represented by the king. The positive side of kingship is we create a society in which we self-govern. True that the Torah envisions a religious society in which decisions are shaped by our relationship to God and figuring out what God would demand of us. That's true. But on the other hand, the book of Devarim speaks about a God who's far away, God who's up in heaven. You visit 3 times a year or whatever, but fundamentally you're an autonomous people. So kingship represents full autonomy. The people are self-governing. And the opposite of that is Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim means a place you have no government because you are under the rule of power. You're slaves, no choices. So the idea of going back to Mitzrayim And that's why specifically the Torah says the king should not go back to Mitzrayim. Because going back to Mitzrayim is an unraveling of history, is an undoing of the story. That's the last thing in the world we'd want to do. And now in the book of Yirmiyahu, we have this remarkable story, which we don't find elsewhere, actually. Certainly not in any kind of detail like this, that the people under the present leadership, which is Yochanan and his associate, have determined to go back to Mitzrayim. And it's a shocker, actually. And they do so specifically against the prophet who tells them what God wants and the possibility of staying in the land. So that's our story over here. And actually, in chapter 43, it gets even worse than that. Because in chapter 43, we are told, Yirmiyahu argues with them, of course. Yirmiyahu says, don't do it. For two reasons. First of all, don't leave. There's an opportunity here if you stay in the land to build it up. That's what God wants you to do, and you'll have divine assistance. But also in chapter 43, going to Mitzrayim is a terrible idea because you will get, first of all, you'll become connected to the culture of Mitzrayim. And the culture of Mitzrayim that's spelled out in Yirmiyahu, and to some degree in Yechezkel as well, talk about a corrupt culture. The Chumash, actually, it's very interesting. The Chumash speaks about Mitzrayim in Sefer Shemot. It doesn't speak very much about the corrupt culture of Mitzrayim. It speaks about being enslaved by them, life being embittered by them, all that. Pharaoh tries to kill them, that's true. But it actually speaks very little about the culture of Egypt. It doesn't say much about their religious practices. It says that the Korban Pesach would have been difficult to bring in Mitzrayim because that practice would be seen as an abomination to the Egyptians. But it talks very little about, explicitly little, about Egyptian worship, Egyptian gods. There are intimations of it in the sense that some of the plagues, which are directed against the people, but also perhaps against their gods, that's perhaps implicit. God says, I will carry out a battle against the gods of Egypt. That is true. We know of the sun god, for example, which is Ra. And we know that the Chumash plays with the name Ra. On more than one occasion in Sefer Shemot, plays on the name Ra. Ruki Ra'ah neged Penechem. Atayadata et am kibbur Rahu. Aaron said to Moshe when he built the golden calf, after he built it. The plague of darkness is the ninth plague. So it could be seen as a plague against the God of Egypt, not only against the people of Egypt and against Pharaoh. That's all true, but it's not really explicit in the text. It's hinted at in the text. And perhaps the ancient reader understood it better than we do, but it's not really explicit. What's explicit is the suffering, etc. But elsewhere in the Bible, in Yechezkel and Yirmiyahu, it talks about a culture. It talks about a idol worship. And that's what Yirmiyahu says in chapter 43. Don't go there because you'll get caught up in the idolatry of Egypt. And that's why you got banished in the first place, because you have forsaken God. Furthermore, he adds, of course, it's not safe there. You think you're safe in Mitzrayim, you won't be safe. You still won't be safe from the Babylonians. That's all true. But it is interesting that, so Yirmiyahu talks about Mitzrayim as a place of idolatry, a place where the culture is actually tainted. The Torah says in the book of Vayikra, Kamasei Eretz Mitzrayim lo tasu. In the book of Vayikra, do not do what the Egyptians do and the Canaanites do. And that's in chapter 18 of Vayikra. Talks about the various prohibited relationships, certain idolatrous practices. So there you have in the Chumash, actually, in the book of Vayikra, chapter 18, a mention that Mitzrayim is a place of illicit practice. But it still is very interesting that in the book of Exodus, Sefer Shemot, we don't have very much of that. But it's explicit in chapter 43 of Yirmiyahu. And then we have the remarkable response in chapter 43 of the women who say to Yirmiyahu, No, the opposite is true. The reason we were exiled from the land was because we stopped idolatry. Had we kept up with the idolatry, we would have been okay. But the problem happened, the calamity took place when we stopped worshiping these foreign gods. Perhaps there's a reference in their statement in chapter 43, perhaps there's a reference to the Reformation of Yoshiyahu. Remember that King Yoshiyahu had inaugurated a great Reformation. He had destroyed the idols and killed the priests and all that. However, we remember as well that, and this is mentioned both in the book of Malachim and the Yirmiyahu as well, we know that it didn't actually prevent the exile. Book of Chronicles, Divrei HaYamim speaks of this, and the question is why not, but de facto it did not prevent the exile. So perhaps what these women are saying in chapter 43 is their interpretation as to why Yoshiyahu's Reformation did not prevent the exile. We have our own terutzim, as it were. Their teretz is different. It's the very Reformation itself which caused the exile. Had we kept up with our idolatry, we might never have ended up in the land of Egypt. That's a rather shocking, to put it mildly, statement. That is what Yirmiyahu encounters at the end of his career with all his moralizing, preaching, and warnings, which obviously came true. He had warned about the Babylonians. Everything he said came true. At the end of the day, he still has to deal with the people that want to go back to Mitzrayim and really deny everything he said throughout his life. That's the tragic ending of the book of Yirmiyahu. Not the very end, but it's the end of Yirmiyahu with the prophecies about other nations. But this is a deep tragedy over here. And in point of fact, they go down to Egypt. And Yirmiyahu actually goes with them. Whether he has a choice or not is not clear. They take him down to Egypt. Would he have gone anyway? I've always wondered about that. He is a prophet who chose to be with the people. He could have gone to Babel and lived very safely and securely. He chooses not to do so. He chooses to be with Gedaliah, whom he supports. And the tragedy, of course, with the assassination of Gedaliah, we have the tragedy and story. We end up in Mitzrayim. I thought it was an interesting segue, given the fact that we are a week before Pesach and the Haggadah and the Seder, which presents its own set of problems this year for us, Jewish people. So I thought it was an interesting segue into saying something about the Seder. There was a request last week that we talk somewhat about Pesach. Perfectly happy to do so. And it turns out that, by coincidence, it's very appropriate to the chapter that we are looking at. And I would add one other thing before we get to saying something about Pesach and the Seder, that the assassination of Gedaliah by Yishmael is very interesting in the sense that it seems to play off a story of the Chumash. And the story seems to play off Yishmael and his 10 men who assassinate Gedaliah and cause us to go down to Egypt. Yes. It is obviously deeply related to the story of Joseph. The story of Joseph, of course, is Joseph is sent to find his brothers. Joseph is sent by Yaakov to reconcile with his brothers, to start over again. The brothers hate Yosef and resent their father as well, no doubt. And Yosef is sent by his father to make peace. Go says Jacob to Joseph. Yaakov's concerned about the hatred, and he had rebuked Joseph, why are you saying these things? And he sends Joseph to find his brothers, to reconcile Joseph and the brothers. Are they not in the city of Shechem? That's chapter 37. Shechem is a city of brotherly responsibility. Go find your brothers in Shechem, speak to them a word of peace, and bring me back a word of peace. See how they're doing. That was Jacob's attempt to reconcile. The problem in the Chumash and the story of Yosef is that he doesn't get there on time. He doesn't actually meet them in Shechem. You get the sense in the Torah, if he had met them in Shechem, everything would be all right. But Joseph doesn't meet them in Shechem. Because the Torah says in chapter 37 that Joseph got lost. He's wandering lost in the field, and a man finds him. And the man says to Joseph, "What are you searching for? What are you looking for? Matavakesh, what are you searching for?" And Joseph says in chapter 37 of Breshit, Et achai anochi mevakesh. I seek my brothers, searching for my brothers. Tell me, he says, Agida efohem roim, where are they? Vayomra ish nasu mizeh, and the man says they've traveled from here. Ki shamati omrim necha dotaina. I heard them say they're going to Dotan. They're not in Shechem, they're in Dotan. So Joseph goes to Dotan to find his brothers with his word of peace. And the Torah says, Vayiru tomei rachok. They saw him from a distance. And from a distance, they conspired to kill him. They said to each other, look, the dreamer is coming. The dreamer is coming towards us. And let's take him and kill him and throw him in a pit. And let's see what becomes of his dreams. So Ruvain, at that point in chapter 37, speaks up. We shouldn't kill him, throw him in the pit, but we shouldn't kill him with our own hands. Ruvain distinguishes between killing with your own hands and causing his death. That's his distinction. But his intention is to save Joseph. He figures we'll throw him in the pit. And when nobody is looking, I'll pull him out of the pit and I'll bring him back to his father. That's Reuven's thinking. Meanwhile, they sit down to eat, and they see a caravan of traders coming in the distance. Who are the traders? They see a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilad, and Yehuda speaks up. Why should we kill our brother? We are killing him, causing his death, killing him. It's the same thing, says Judah. We're killing him. We shouldn't do that. Rather, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. And our hand should not be against him. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh. And the brothers heard. What does heard mean? Heard could mean they accepted it. Heard could mean they heard what he's saying, they're thinking about it. It's not clear. Meanwhile, the next verse is Vayavru Alashim Bidyanim Socharim. Midianite traders came by and they pulled Joseph out of the pit and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 kesef, 20 silver coins. Vayaridu Oto Mitzrayma, and they brought him down to Egypt. That's the story of the sale of Joseph. The simple reading of the text, obviously, is that the brothers didn't really sell him. Not only did they not sell him, they don't actually know what happened to him. Reuven goes back to the pit. He says to his brothers, he's missing. What is to be of me? The boy is missing. They intended to sell him, but somebody gets there first. The Midianites get there first. The Ishmaelites bring him down to Mitzrayim. That's the story. They pull Joseph out of the pit. And the brothers, how many brothers are there? There are 10 brothers. Actually, Joseph has 11 brothers, but it's clear that one of the brothers is not there, namely Benjamin. It's clear from the story later on that the responsible parties are 10. As the Torah says, when they went down to Egypt later to get food, Vayerdu Achei Yosef Asara. The 10 brothers went down to Mitzrayim. So the story over here that's the story of Joseph going down to Egypt, which is the beginning of the story of Mitzrayim. Joseph is a captive in the land of Egypt. He's a captive of a very, very nice life, a gilded captive. He's a viceroy, he has his chariot, but he comes to understand that at the end of his life, He was the first slave. Joseph was the first slave. The story of going down to Mitzrayim, being captured in Mitzrayim, captive, not being able to get out. The first Jew we know who can't get out is Joseph. Jacob gets out. But Joseph says, someday God will redeem us. That's how the book of Bereshit ends. Someday God will redeem us, take my body with you, bring me back with you. So Joseph was the first captive. And the story of the descent into Mitzrayim begins with Joseph, sold there in effect, indirectly. But the cause of his sale are the 10 brothers who throw him in the pit, brought down by Ishmael. And here in our story, in the book of Yirmiyahu, of course, it plays off exactly that. Because it's Ishmael and his 10 men who come with him. And not only that, but we're told later on, after they killed Gedaliah and the people with Gedaliah, the story continues that they meet a bunch of people. It's interesting. This is found in chapter 41. Look at chapter 41. Verse number 4, in chapter 41. The day after Gedaliah was killed, nobody knew about it, that Gedaliah was actually dead. And people came from Shechem. Here we have the mention of Shechem on top of everything else. Mishilo, Mishamron, from Shechem, from Shiloh and Shomron, Shmonim ish, Megurachei Zakan, Kuei Begadim, Mitgodadim, Umincha Uavona, Biyadam, Lavi Beit Hashem. We are told of these people, it's not clear why, because it's not known that Gedaliah was killed. Maybe they're mourning, they're wearing torn garments, their bodies were gashed. This is signs of mourning. We are forbidden to do this in the Torah, but these are signs of mourning. These are signs of mourning. So they're coming with as mourners from these cities. The first is Shechem, bringing, we're told, mincha ulavona biyadam. Mincha, a meal offering, ulavona, and incense. They're bringing these things to God's house. They want to bring a sacrifice. And Ishmael comes out to greet them. And he says to them, go, why don't you come to Gedaliah? Pretending Gedaliah is alive. And when they come with him, in verse number 7, Vayishchatem Yishmael ben Netanya el toch habar, huva hanashim asher ito, it says they threw the people into a pit, into a bar. So we have the bar here as well. We have the pit. And it's interesting that when Joseph is sold to Egypt, they see traders from a distance. Nechotu tzri v'lo tochim lo rid Mitzrayma. They're bringing spices down to Egypt. They're Ishmaelite traders who bring spices. Nechotu tzri v'lo. And here the 80 people are bringing mincha ulavona. Lavona is also a spice, incense, used for incense. So it's called frankincense, actually, lavona, frankincense. So the elements of the story are all here. The 10 men, Ishmael, the bar, Mitzrayim. And the suggestion that would be that, and why is it told in this fashion? What do we glean from this? Perhaps what we glean from this is that what overhangs the whole story of the exile in the book of Yirmiyahu, and especially in the book of Malachim, is the division between the people, the disunity. The fact that you have a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, not one people, but you have two peoples, inevitably leads to exile, to dispersion. It's the disunity. And even over here, there's all kinds of disunities. There's the prophet on one hand, there's the people, within the people, there's Ishmael. He's the traitor, he kills Gedaliah, etc. He's aligned with the king of Ammon. So it's the not having one unified people, but the disunity is what brings us down to Mitzrayim. It's Joseph and the brothers. is what is the cause, the direct cause of being in Egypt in the first place. And I thought that it was interesting in terms of Pesach, in terms of story of the Exodus, story of the Seder, that what is preliminary to leaving Mitzrayim, Yetziat Mitzrayim, that we read about in the Chumash and celebrate through the Seder, is the Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach, the Torah says, before you leave Egypt, you have to bring the Paschal sacrifice. So I want to talk about this Paschal sacrifice in conjunction with our chapter, but I'll pause for a moment. If anybody wants to speak up and comment, please do. Happy to hear from anybody. Any comment about what's been seen so far? And then we'll move into something about the Seder in our remaining time. If you speak up, just unmute yourselves and speak up.
You're unmuted. Everyone is unmuted.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So what's the reference to this boar that Asa made, Asa Mipnei Basha?
Yes, that actually supports what I just said. Asa and Basha was Asa is the king of Judah and Basha is the king of Israel.
Right.
And there was a civil war between those two.
Right.
So the reference over here, it's exactly, actually, I had that in mind. It's a reference to what I spoke about with the disunity. It's not just you have two kingdoms, but on more than one occasion, there's war between the kingdoms. Civil war, actually. So the reference here to civil war is very appropriate, given the fact that this is what this is actually about. It's about the inability of the people to be on the same page, everybody going their own path. And it's a good point over here that the verse you're referring to is verse number 9. Habara Sherishlich Shem Yishmael, it's called Pigrei Anashim. That's the boar that Asa Melech Asa Mipnei Basha Melech Yisrael. So the boar is either some kind of a defensive, like a marginal line, a kind of defensive line. It's not clear. But what is clear is that the boar is representing the division between North and South, and not just division between North and South, but the enmity and the strife and the war which takes place. And there's more than one occasion when there are battles between the northern and southern kingdoms, and there are occasions where the northern kingdom aligns itself with some foreign enemy to attack the southern kingdom. So the history of the people, as recorded in the book of Melachim, is of division, enmity, and strife, which of course, the paradigm for all of this is the story of Joseph. So it's not accidental that the story of Joseph is behind the story here. Of course, Yishmael is the one who brings Joseph down to Mitzrayim. I'm not going to get into Yishmael at this point, but the point I wanted to make is that the descent to Mitzrayim is in some sense a replay of the Joseph story and of the disunity, and that the antidote, one might say, the leaving Mitzrayim in the Chumash is preceded by the Korban Pesach. The Chumash makes it very clear, you can't leave Egypt until you bring the Korban Pesach. That's chapter 12. Until you bring the Korban Pesach, you can't walk out. In fact, the Chumash says, in a verse that is very timely for us, unfortunately, the Chumash says, V'atem lo teitzu ish mipetach beito ad boker. Nobody is to leave their house until the morning. So we are confined to our homes on the night of Passover. We are to eat the Korban Pesach inside the house. And the Chumash says in chapter 12 of the book of Exodus, and nobody is permitted to leave the house until the morning. That is to say, until the Paschal sacrifice has been both brought in the day, eaten at night, and only after that, only after the Korban Pesach is brought and is appropriately observed, then you can leave your home. But at the time when the Korban Pesach is to be brought, you can't leave your home. And apparently for two reasons. One is that it's dangerous outside, because that night there is a devastating plague, a sword that runs through the land of Egypt. The destroying angel is present. It's not safe to go out. Everybody has to stay inside. But there seems to be an additional reason why you don't go outside. You don't go outside because the house becomes the sanctuary. Because the Korban Pesach is above all a sacrifice, and a sacrifice has an altar. And the altar for the Korban Pesach is the doorpost and the lintel. The house itself is the altar. And we know that sacrifices often are eaten within a special place. Sacrifice has this holiness to it. Holiness demands limitation of time and space. It's essential to Kedusha. Limitation of time and space. So, for example, in the temple in Jerusalem, some sacrifices could be eaten in the city of Jerusalem. Some sacrifices could only be eaten inside the temple proper, depending on the sacrifice. But every sacrifice has its space. The space for the sacrifice on the night of Pesach was the house. So therefore, you can't leave the house for two reasons. It's not safe to go out. But apart from that, because the observance of the Korban Pesach is within the house. The house is both the altar. The house is also the place where you eat it. And the house has a third function in the Chumash. Because the Torah says in chapter 12 that the Korban Pesach is to be brought Sela Beit Avot Sela Bayit. A lamb for the leader of the house, Beit Avot, for each house, each house, a lamb for the house. So each house brings the sacrifice, and then the Torah said, what about if you have a few people in your house? You have a very small family. If your family is too small to devour an entire lamb, then you join with your neighbor. You join with the neighbor, and between the two families together, you'll be able to properly observe the Paschal sacrifice. So the key word in the Korban Pesach is the word bayit. Now the word bayit has more than one meaning, many meanings for bayit. It can mean a physical house. It can mean a family. And it means a family in the very beginning of the book of Exodus. The beginning of the book of Exodus talks about these are the names, Ela Shemot. These are the names of Jacob's sons who came down to Egypt. Ish ubeito ba'u. Each one came with his bayit. Each one came with his house. It means each one came with his family. When we came down to Egypt, says the Torah, we had a bayit. We had many batim. We had many houses. But what happened over the course of the next 11 chapters, through the assimilation and through the persecution and the enslavement, we lost a sense of what it means to be community. A bunch of slaves, it's very difficult for slaves to be a real community because they don't have, their time is not their own. They can't make their own choices. So what happens is that this community, which we once had, when we came down to Egypt, together with Yaakov, Ishu Beito Bo, that dissolves over the course of the next chapters. And Moshe's mission is to rebuild the sense of bayit, to rebuild the sense of community. And the Korban Pesach is the act which represents the rebuilding of community, without which you can't leave Egypt. Because if you left Mitzrayim without any bayit whatsoever, a bunch of slaves wandering in the desert, no sense of peoplehood, no sense of nationhood. So the bayit is the prerequisite to leaving. And what's interesting is, in terms of this bayit, that actually the Korban Pesach, it's a point I've made many times over the years about the Korban Pesach, is not actually something new. I mean, it is new in the sense we've never seen a Korban Pesach before. It's chapter 12. It's the prerequisite to leaving. But in point of fact, the idea of the Korban Pesach is already found earlier in the book of Exodus on more than one occasion, several occasions. Because we all remember that when Moshe goes to Paro, speaks to Paro, he says to Paro, I want permission to leave the land of Egypt, 3-day journey, so we can bring sacrifices to our God. And Paro says initially, how can we do that? There's so many of you. We can't afford to lose all the work. There are too many of you, etc. So at one point, it's interesting. So that's Paro's excuse. There's many excuses. At one point, after one of the plagues, I think it's the 4th plague, Paro says to Moshe, you can bring the sacrifice. You can't bring it inside the land because the Egyptians will not tolerate sacrifices inside the land. But you can bring the sacrifice. He agrees. You can bring your sacrifice. But don't go too far away. You were talked about going 3-day journey. 3-day journey is too far. Paro may be afraid that the Jews will run away. Don't go too far. And Moshe agrees. Fine. Perfectly happy. We'll bring the sacrifice a little distance out of Mitzrayim so the Egyptians won't be upset about bringing these animals as sacrifices. They won't accept that. Okay. So when Moshe agreed, and Moshe agrees to Paro's demand, don't go too far, and presumably Paro's demand is don't go too far, because otherwise I'm afraid you'll run away. But if you go nearby, you can't run away. That demonstrates that Moshe's request to bring the sacrifice was not about running away. He has no intention of running away. He has every intention of returning to the land. So what then is the point of the sacrifice if he intends to come back, which apparently he does intend to come back. But the point of the sacrifice is something else. He does intend to leave, for sure, but not now. But Moshe understands that before you leave, you have to be a people. And what unifies the people is everybody serving one God. That's why Moshe insists everybody's got to be there. The men, the women, the children, the old, the young. Everybody's got, even the possessions we have as a community. It's the people, it's all the people, it's what we have, what we own. We have to serve this God as one people. And until we do that, there's no point to walk out, because you can't get any place if you have total disunity. So the Korban Pesach, the Bayit, was the necessary prerequisite to leaving Mitzrayim. And I think it's a very appropriate prerequisite given the fact that what got us there in the first place is the disunity. Story of Yosef is the story that overhangs the story of Mitzrayim. And it is very appropriate that what Moshe does when we're leaving Egypt is he takes Joseph's bones. Torah goes out of its way to emphasize that Moshe went and brought Yosef back with the people. That's very important symbolically, that the people consist of all different types of people. We don't even have to like each other so much. It's less important, but we have to understand we're all on the same page. We have to work together with the other. Like, dislike, it's another story. Brothers never loved Joseph, but the fact is, Joseph is important. Joseph is with us. We're all on the same team here. We have to be able to work together. So the Korban Pesach is the prerequisite to leaving, and a very appropriate one. And of course, it's interesting, by the way, something else. And then I'll pause for a moment if anybody has any questions. Here's what's very interesting. I mean, it's all interesting, actually, but here's an interesting point. The Chumash in the book of Exodus, in Sefer Shemot, talks about the Paschal sacrifice. You're in your house. You take the blood of the sacrifice. You put it on the lintel and the doorposts. And that's what you do in Pesach. But in the book of Exodus, it sounds like, actually, if you just read the book of Exodus, it sounds like it's not just what you do in the land of Egypt, but it sounds like when you later on come into the land, you're going to do the same thing. Because after the Torah describes what you do in the book of Exodus, the Torah says, when you come into the land and your children may ask the question, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem. What are you doing? What is this service for you? Why are you doing this? And when you open up the Chumash and find this verse in the Torah, let's find this verse in the Torah. Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem. Where is that verse? Yes, it's in chapter 12 of Exodus, chapter 12. So in chapter 12, beginning, say, in verse 21, chapter 12, in the JPS, it's on page 137. Chapter 12, verse 21, Moshe calls all the elders, and he tells them what to do to bring the Paschal sacrifice. And then he says in verse 22, take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood, and apply the blood to the lintel and the doorposts. This is what you got to do. Slaughter the animal, take the blood, and put it on the doorpost and the lintel. Don't leave the house till the morning. Don't leave till the morning. We discussed that earlier, the two reasons you can't leave. And God will pass through Egypt, and God will see the blood, and God will either pass over the house or hover to protect the house. Pasach can mean to pass over or to hover above. More likely it means to hover above to protect, not to pass over, actually. The name Passover is probably a misnomer. It's hovering above. The better interpretation. Doesn't matter for our purposes. And God will not allow the destroyer to come. God will protect the house. It's less about passing over the house and more about protection. What the Gemara calls Leil Shimurim, a night of protection. Okay. And then it says you should do this thing, Ushmaitem et hadavar hazeh, have this observance, L'chak l'cha u'levanecha ad olam. This observance shall be forever. What observance shall be forever? Sounds like the Paschal sacrifice and the blood on the doorposts. How else can you read it? It's a simple reading, right? And when you come into the land, Ushmartem et avodah hazot, you will continue to do this. In your homes, you put blood on the doorposts. And your children will ask you, what is this? What are you doing? Why do you put blood on the doorposts? It's crazy. What's going on here? No, this is a remembrance of the Pesach that God hovered above the house of Israel when God smote the Egyptians and God saved our house. So the idea of the blood on the doorposts is the idea of saving the house. As I said, the name Passover is probably a misnomer. Shouldn't be called Passover. It's not about passing over. It's about protection. Pasach is to protect, to hover above. It's what the prophet Eliyahu said to the people at Mount Carmel. Ad motem atai poschim al shtei hasifim. You can't hover in two places. You can't be in two places. So it's hovering above to protect from the destroyer. Fine. So what happens? We don't put blood on our doorpost, do we? We don't. So that what happened was, you open up the Chumash and you read the book of Devarim. The book of Devarim, which is a fascinating book, contradicts the rest of the Torah in many places. Many, many, many places. All kinds of contradictions. The project of the medievals, and already is found in the Gemara, was to reconcile Devarim with the rest of the Chumash. So the Ramban and Rashi, of course, try to reconcile the many contradictions. There are all kinds of contradictions. Contradictions in terms of the stories, and there's also contradictions in terms of some of the laws. They're different, and sometimes seem to be contradictory. And the place which is most striking is the Korban Pesach. Because the Torah said, when it comes to the Korban Pesach, Lo tuchal lasot et ha-Pesach bi'achad shi'arecha. You are not permitted to bring the Korban Pesach in your gates, in your towns, in your homes. Rather, the Korban Pesach is brought only in the place that God is choosing, in the temple. That's a chiddush, to put it mildly, because the Torah in the book of Exodus says you bring it in your house, and not only that, you put the blood on the doorpost of your home. That's why the kids are asking what's going on with the blood on the door. When you come to the land in the book of Devarim, that's forbidden. You don't bring it in your house. You don't even bring it in your town. You bring it in the central place. So this is what we follow. And we have to then reinterpret what the Chumash said in the book of Exodus. You should do this service when you come into the land. Doesn't refer to the blood. Refers to the Korban Pesach in general. You still have a Korban Pesach, even though you're out of Egypt. But in terms of the specifics of it, the blood and all that, no, that's only in Mitzrayim. That's Pesach Mitzrayim. But Pesach L'Dorot is different. Okay, that's fine. So what I was thinking was the following. The Seder, and this year this presents a great challenge for the Jewish people. What's interesting is we have a custom to open up the door before the second half of the Seder. It's a very old custom to open the door. And I was wondering, what is that actually about? Opening up the door. And it struck me that a couple of thoughts about it, but one of them is that what you often find in Jewish tradition is that the Chumash seems to say X. Comes along the rabbinic tradition and says, the Chumash may seem to say X, but our practice is very different. The Chumash couldn't be more clear about it, that you bring the Paschal sacrifice inside your house and you throw the blood on the door of your house, your building, and you do this forever. Comes along the book of Devarim with a reinterpretation. That's not the case. Everything is centralized in Sefer Devarim. Everything. There's one central government, there's one central place, there's one central leadership, and there's one central place of ritual observance. All the other places are out, including the Korban Pesach. And the Torah goes out of its way to say, don't bring the Korban Pesach in your homes. Okay, so we follow the book of Devarim. One can even see Devarim as a kind of, it's not exactly this, but it's a kind of midrash. It's a kind of the beginnings of rabbinic interpretation. Can be found in Sefer Devarim. Okay, so we don't throw the blood on their doorposts. But what's interesting is that the Jewish tradition, the Jewish people have determined not to lose the plain meaning of the text. So we don't throw the blood on the doorposts, but the Seder is a ritual in which the house becomes the center of the ritual. So the idea of opening up the doors strikes me that what we're saying is come into this space, come into this house. Because we don't want to abandon the core idea of the Chumash, which is that the Korban Pesach is a ritual within the Bayit, like no other. So the Seder becomes a ritual in which the focus is the house, like no other ritual. We have Chanukah to some extent, near Yishu Beito. But the Korban Pesach is a home-centered ritual. And it's actually very interesting that, without question, it is both the core ritual of the Jewish people, it's the beginning of peoplehood, but it's also the most observed ritual of the Jewish people, by far. Now, there are different kinds of Siddharim, but fundamentally, it's rooted in the house. And rooting it in the house and opening up those doors, come into my house, that goes back to the plain meaning of the Torah. So often you find this, I think, it's an interesting study, that you have a halacha, the Torah seems to say X, and then you have the rabbinic understanding or reinterpretation, and then you have the common practice of the people that in some sense takes us back to the plain meaning of the text. It'd be good to study this and see if we can find other examples of this. I can't off the top of my head. I remember working on this a long time ago and finding 2 or 3 other examples of exactly this phenomenon. Okay. Now I had another. Yes.
If opening the door is supposed to be what you said, then why do we do it? Would we do it so late in the Seder? Why wouldn't we do it right at the beginning? If the idea is to bring people in before the ritual starts and to
Right, so we do that as well. We don't do it by opening the door.
Well, we do it by saying halachman.
Rachmanya, kol dich v'nyete v'yecho kol disrich yesei v'yivsach. The Seder begins with an invitation. Okay, let me respond to that. We actually have two invitations that we make at the Seder. The first invitation is before we start. It's not actually before we start. It's very striking that the invitation to join us is after we make Kiddush. We don't invite people before Kiddush. We invite people after Kiddush. First you make Kiddush, and then before you start, the section we call Magid, before Manishtana. We have this invitation in Aramaic, Holach Ma'anya, Kol dich v'nyete v'yechu, Kol disrich yetsei v'yivsach. That's one kind of invitation. And then we have another invitation where we open up the door after the meal. We're about to complete Hallel and say the great Hallel. And before we do that, we open up the door, presumably to invite people into the house. And the truth of the matter is that in opening the door is a very old custom, ancient custom. Later, it becomes identified with the prophet Eliyahu, that we are inviting Eliyahu into the house. But it would appear that inviting Eliyahu into the house is much later, because at least as far as we could attest, inviting the whole idea of Eliyahu is not more than 600 or 700 years old. And the opening up the doors appears already in the time of the Gaonim. It's well over 1,000 years, more than that. So it would appear that opening the doors initially is not about inviting Eliyahu to the house. It's something else. So what that something else is a very good question. But it's very old. It's pre-medieval. So I made a suggestion about opening up the doors, which is the following suggestion. So we have two invitations, as it were. The first is what we say, come and eat, come and join us. Right? Now we're here, next year in Jerusalem, that's the beginning. And then we have opening the door before we start, I would say, part 2 of the Seder, which is, or the end of the Seder, which is the recitation of the completion of the Hallel and the other Hallel, and then we had the Seder. So I was thinking the following thought. The mitzvah of the night, the mitzvah of Pesach night, the Haggadah has a name for it. The very beginning of the Haggadah, it says no matter how much we know, how wise we may be, old, wise, etc. Mitzvah leinu l'saper b'tziat Mitzrayim. There's a mitzvah to l'saper b'tziat Mitzrayim. L'saper is to tell a story. Is to tell the story of the Exodus. It's interesting, the language is l'saper b'tziat Mitzrayim, not l'saper et yitziat Mitzrayim. So l'saper b suggests perhaps more engagement, more involvement. That's what Rabbi Soloveitchik pointed out. L'saper b suggests more than just telling a story. It involves full engagement. It involves study. The night is the night of Midrash. B'doresh kol ha'parsha kula, says the Mishnah, to engage in Midrash, a deeper understanding. So the first invitation takes place after Kiddush. After Kiddush. Were we simply inviting people for the meal, it would make much more sense to invite people before Kiddush, because the Seder starts with Kiddush. So it appears that the invitation is not so much to join us for the meal, even though we do mention eating the Paschal sacrifice, etc. But the very invitation itself is after Kiddush, and that suggests, to me at least, that the invitation is for something different. It's the invitation to join us in telling the story. The idea being that the more people you bring in to tell the story, the better story you're going to get, because everybody has their own understanding, their own interpretation. And the Seder is an exercise in study, because it involves the study of people, peers coming together. Those are the five Tanaim who gathered together in Bnei Brak, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva. But it largely involves intergenerational learning parents and children. Starts with Manishtana, and the custom is the youngest child asks the question. And then the Haggadah continues, Keneged Arba Abanim Dibra Torah. The Torah speaks, as it were, of 4 different kinds of children. So there's an understanding that different people have to be spoken to differently. Different people come from different places. And the Haggadah is all about joining together in a kind of community, and through the learning, becoming a community, strengthening the community through the study, through the questioning. Questions are very important. So the whole way Maggid is framed as a questions and answers. I pointed out a couple of years ago, and it's in my Haggadah several years ago, that even the way we end Maggid, how do we end the first part of the Seder Maggid? We end Maggid by reciting 2 Psalms. We begin Hallel at the end of Maggid. And we end Maggid with the Psalm, B'tzeit Yisrael Mitzrayim, which is the second Psalm of Hallel, Psalm 114. That's how we end the Maggid. After we say B'tzeit Yisrael Mitzrayim, we make a blessing. Asher Ga'alanu, Ga'al Yisrael, and we drink the second cup of wine. But B'tzeit Yisrael Mitzrayim, apart from the fact that it mentions Mitzrayim, is a very interesting psalm, because it's one of the few psalms that we have that's question and answer. Malachayam kitanus hayaden tisol v'yachar herim tirkedu kerim givaot kivnetzon. It fits in perfectly with the entire Maggid, which is all about questions and answer. To the degree that in the text of the Haggadah that we have the statement from the Mishnah of Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel said, whoever didn't say these three things on the night of Pesach at the Seder did not fulfill the obligation. Pesach, matzah, umara. Then the Haggadah goes on and says, Pesach zo she'anu ochlim al shumah. Why do we eat the Pesach? What does it represent? What does it convey to us? And then the same thing for matzah. Matzah zo, the matzah that we eat, al shumah. What is the source? What is the significance? And the same thing with the Mara. When you open up the Mishnah, what you see is that when the Mishnah, it's coming from the Mishnah, but the Mishnah didn't phrase it as a question. The Mishnah phrased it as a statement. Pesach zo al shem, matzah zo al shem. Pesach because, matzah because, Mara because. It didn't frame it as question and answer. But when it comes to the Haggadah, it changes the language of the Mishnah from statement to question and answer. This was noted by Rabbi Tabori, noted this. I mentioned in my Haggadah. But he didn't notice the other thing, which is that the psalm that we choose to end with is also question and answer. Why are you skipping like rams? Why are you running away, O Jordan? It's actually 4 questions. There we have the 4 questions. Malachayam ki tanus, hayaden tisov v'yachar. It's 2 questions. He'arim tirkedu ke'elim givaot kivnetzon. 4 questions. Why? And there's an answer. Milufnei adon chuli aretz, milufnei alo Yaakov. Before the God chuli aretz. What does it mean, chuli aretz? So there's a long answer to that and a short answer. I'll give the short answer. So chuli aretz, the plain meaning of chuli aretz could be, cholel means to create. Before the God who created the land. Before the God of Jacob. That's the plain meaning of chuli aretz. But chuli aretz carries with it a different significance over here as well. Not just the creator of. But lachul has 2 different senses to it. It could be related to the word chil, which is fear. In the Song of the Sea, chil ochaz yoshvei Pulashet. Fear gripped the inhabitants of Plishtim. At the end of the song, we're told that Miriam went out with the women, b'tupim uv'mecholot, with musical instruments. So mecholot is dancing and singing and rejoicing. So the question to the hills and the rivers, oh rivers, why do you run away? And hills, why do you skip like lambs? Tirkedu, rocate is to dance. The mountains, the hills, the world is both at the same time running away and dancing. It's doing both at the same time. It's running away and dancing. Why do you run away and dance, O world? And the answer is, Milifnei Adon Chuli Aretz. We fear the fearsome God, the God of the sea, who drowned the Egyptians, the God of war. That's fear. But there's also the idea of redemption and rejoicing. That's also chuli. So the chuli picked up on both. The deeper point, of course, is that the Hallel is based on Shirat Hayam. That's one piece of my essays in the Haggadah. And I've refined that over time. But that's an important point. But coming back to the question, why do we open the door? Why do we invite people in the beginning of the Seder? We invite people in the beginning of the Seder before we start Magid. Because in order to have a Magid, a good Magid, you need somebody else with you. In order to tell your story, to tell the story of the Exodus, telling a story involves another. So telling a story involves another. And therefore, we want as many people as possible to study with us, to hear their interpretations. We can share our understanding. We can ask a lot of questions. And from all of this, hopefully, will come out a better understanding this year than we had prior. So that's the invitation in the beginning of the Seder. But why did we open the door after the meal? Why are we opening the door after the meal? So I suggest that the truth is this. When we talk about customs and minhag, it's very difficult to know where it's coming from. All explanations after the fact, and the explanations typically pick up on a text, something like that. But often the explanations, I think, are more rooted less in philosophy and more in psychology. It's about the human experience very often, and it's very hard to know, to figure it out. It's a lot of guesswork, speculation. So I'll also speculate as to why we opened the door after the meal. And my suggestion, I think it's found in the Haggadah that I wrote, I don't remember. But my suggestion is that it's related to the Hallel. Because after the meal, we complete Hallel. And the last chapter of Hallel is really about a personal redemption. Min ha-meitzar karati ya. I cry to you, God, out of ha-meitzar, from the narrow spaces. Meitzar plays off the word Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim, of course, is in every generation we see ourselves as leaving Egypt. And that has many different meanings. But there's also a personal Yetziat Mitzrayim. Min ha-meitzar. And in that description of the person's self-description, Psalm 118, unbelievable psalm, is the description of somebody who feels that he or she has been redeemed, has been saved, and the obligation to tell the other person. The verse that comes to mind in the Hallel, Lo amut ki ehyeh v'asaper ma'aseyah. I have not died, I live. V'asaper ma'aseyah, I will tell others about what God has done. And the person in the psalm actually sets out to find the others. Psalm 118 is a story. There's actually a story in Hallel. It's one of the better insights of my Haggadah, frankly. I love that insight. It's very powerful. Psalm 118 is a story. Somebody's been redeemed, and somebody is searching for other people to tell the story to, because it's one thing to praise God privately, and there's another level to speak to the other. And Hallel is about speaking to the other. Hallel is responsive. Hodu Hashem ki tov, response. Hodu Hashem ki tov. It's responsive. So before we say that, complete the Hallel, we invite people into the house. We invite them l'saper ma'aseyah. The first half of the Seder, we invite them for Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. In the second half of the Seder, we invite them because of the verse we say in the Hallel, Lo amut ki ehyeh v'asaper ma'aseyah. If I live by God's grace, I want to tell others about my experience, about my redemption, about my salvation. So that is the second half of the Seder. So each of the two parts of the Seder involve an invitation, and they revolve around the idea of Sipur, of telling the story of the Exodus, its importance, its significance, many pieces to that, the beginning of nationhood, peoplehood, mutual responsibility. And then the second half, of course, is about redemption, national and personal redemption, which also requires a telling. It's interesting, by the way, another interesting point, the idea that one who has been redeemed has the responsibility to tell the story is found in two different places in the Hallel, the second part of Hallel, after we eat. The first is found in Psalm 116, one of the greatest psalms that we have. First, Psalm 116, God has heard my cries, and God has redeemed me from death. I will walk in the land of the living. And the next verse, how can I repay this? How do I repay God for the fact that I'm alive? How do I repay that fact? And the answer of the psalmist in Psalm 116 is, I will go to a public place. I will bring a thanksgiving offering before all the people. I'll bring a thanksgiving offering. And I'll bring the sacrifice before all the people. And where is the public space in Psalm 116? In the courtyards of God. Hallelujah. In the midst of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is another word for the temple. The public space in the Bible is the temple. And that's where I can go and give thanksgiving to God. So in Psalm 116, there's an address where one can go to publicly thank God before the people. That's how I can repay. I can tell others about my own personal redemption, my own story, and I go to the public space, which is Jerusalem. That's Psalm 160. But in Psalm 118, there is no defined space. The person who has been saved is searching for this space. And the person hears in Psalm 118 that there is a place where people are telling their stories and people are giving thanks, but it's not a defined place. The place in Psalm 118 is Korina Vishua Biolei Tzadikim. Is this crying in the tents of the righteous? This psalmist, this person hears the cries. What are they saying? Biolei Tzadikim. Yemin Hashem Osechayo, God's right hand has been valiant. Yemin Hashem Romema, God's hand is to be exalted. Yemin Hashem Osechayo. So he hears there is such a place where people are gathering together, Olei Tzadikim, and the person sets out to find that place. It's not defined. It's not Jerusalem. You know what Jerusalem is. But where are the tents of the righteous? Who knows where the tents of the righteous are? It's not defined. So the person is searching and searching to find those spaces. Person is praying, open up the gates. Pitchuli Sharei Tzedek. Open up those gates. There I want to be in that place, Avavom Odeka, where I can give thanks to God. And at the end of the psalm, the person arrives in that place. There's a greeter at the door who says, you've arrived at the place. You've arrived at God's house. Baruch haba b'shem Hashem, beirachnuchem mibeit Hashem. Blessed from God's house. That's the story. At which point, the person says, Eli Yato v'yodeka, Elohai v'aromemeka. Here I can exalt God's name. Now there's more to it than that, and I spell it out in the Haggadah. I'm very proud of that particular essay. It's very powerful. The Hallel is a story. I want to conclude, we're living at a time which presents us with a lot of, Suri, you want to say something?
That I thought, I know we've all been getting all kinds of crazy, jokey WhatsApps to relieve this coronavirus, depression. So one of them was that we can't invite Eliyahu to our Seder this year because he's been in too many other people's houses.
Right. I always think he's the only one you can invite, actually.
Right.
It comes with a chariot of fire. So that removes the virus. But,
Right.
you know,
Right.
I think this year, one of the challenges that we have, especially outside the land of Israel, because in the land of Israel, there's one Seder. So yeah, Wednesday night is Yom Tov, but Friday is not. So you can contact the people, for those people that don't use the phones and the stuff on Yom Tov, older people by themselves, 3 days in a row. Pesach, Seder, terrible business. So here it's 3 days. In Israel, at least it's 1 day, but it's still a problem because the whole idea of the Seder is being together with other people, as we have seen. Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. So it's very, very, it's very daunting. It's very frightening. And it's the one holiday more than any other holiday. That's a family holiday. That's a community, people coming together around the table and talking and studying and singing. And maybe there are ways to overcome that. There's all kinds of discussion about Zooming and all this other thing for the Seder. I personally am in favor of that. I would do it myself, by the way, without question. I think we are underestimating what it means for some people to be alone on Pesach. And there are people who have never done a Seder in their lives. Either they go away, they go to their children, they go to hotels. They've never actually been alone for Seder. And I think it can be devastating for some people in terms of their despair, in terms of, so I think everybody makes their own choices, obviously. There's no one right answer. But I think we should be, cognizant of that. I didn't want to just end with what I mentioned before about the tents of the righteous. You think about the tents of the righteous. You think about Jerusalem, about the temple, I'm thinking about the tents of the righteous as something very different. I'm thinking about the janitors who clean the hospitals and these workers in the hospitals and the volunteers who come who actually put themselves in danger to help others, who are a light to all of us. I mean, it's unbelievable the number of volunteers that are coming into this situation of a deep unknown with initially, certainly on the federal level, a complete lack of leadership and responsibility. And people are basically, there are some heroes who step up to the plate, but basically it's the plain people who come in, it's the nurses, it's the people cleaning these places. It's of course the medical people who are putting themselves at risk. These are the Olei Tzadikim. These are the tents of the righteous. And I think we have to recognize that. Unfortunately, we can't be there. I myself am confined to home. I can't leave. Most of us, outside of essential workers and people with health problems, of course, can't leave. But I think it's very important to recognize that and to figure out each of us what we can do in our own way. I wish I had better insight into that. There are people where I live now in Riverdale, they're doing an enormous amount of chesed and helping to reach out and being careful not to infect other people, which is also very important. We're in a new world right now, I think, and trying to figure out how to deal with this new world. And I was thinking, just to conclude, the Haggadah says that every generation we see ourselves as if we left Egypt. And I think part of what the Haggadah is trying to get us to do is to imagine ourselves in their place. And that's why the Haggadah is completely focused on the event of leaving Egypt. There's very little focus and no focus in the key text of the Seder on what happened later. Yes, we have Dayenu mentions later, but Dayenu was not a core text of the Seder. The core text of the Haggadah stop at the Exodus. Because we have to remember, if we were back in Egypt, we wouldn't know what happens next. We know we're leaving Mitzrayim. We don't know what awaits us in the desert. There is no food. There is no water. It's a long journey. God took us in a circuitous route. So we try to imagine ourselves in that place. How would we respond if we're in that place of unbelievable uncertainty and potential danger? And it's very important, I think, at this time to imagine us, if we can't be in these places, but to put ourselves in that place in order to connect to the people who are there, who are doing this work that I'm sure all of us wish we could do. But for most of us, we can't do that. But we can still appreciate it and connect to those people by imagining being there and trying to figure out what that experience is all about, which after all is one of the core mitzvot of the Seder. In every generation, we see ourselves as if we personally leave Mitzrayim. Chag Kasher v'Sameach.